Before going into the way in which Nietzsche's work was used as a political tool, namely the Genealogy of Morality, I want to start off with the name of the Black Panther Party, since it offers a good segue into an important and useful critique of evolutionary theory that Nietzsche offers in The Gay Science. So, how did Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, how did he choose this animal, the panther? So while he admits that it is a fierce animal, he also adds the caveat that a panther won't attack until it's backed into a corner, right? Then it will strike out. Now, considering the fact that panthers are predatory, infanticidal, and known to kill for the sake of killing, Newton's description is kind of an ironic whitewashing of panthers. And actually, its original name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Now, the scientific euphemism for pleasure-oriented murder is surplus killing, a term coined by Hans Kruuk. And a memorable example comes from Bhutan, where I read that they reported a single leopard, which is a synonym for panther. So a single leopard killed 21 sheep in a single attack, so 21 savage. And now most cats are surplus killers, and the cute little kitties that we put in our homes and pet and love, the cute little kitties, the domestic variety of cats, are responsible for the extinction of entire species of birds, mammals, and reptiles. Now, it would have been inappropriate for Kruuk to talk about pleasure in his landmark paper on surplus killing. Of course, he talks about adaptation, survival value, and ecological balance, since, subjectivity still mounts a pretty strong defense against the growing claws of scientific inquiry. And I think it's an understandable professional fear of being in uncharted waters, of speculating on subjective consciousness. But I think it's clear from my own experience that I don't instinctively think about the technical function of evolutionary advantages of my activities. I don't think about evolutionary survival value when I'm, eating food. I just do it because I'm motivated by what's good and bad. Now, it gets complicated when, I know that I'm planning for my future. I know how nutrition works, but it's separate from the basic experience of these things, of feelings and chemical rewards. And Kruuk brings up a crucial point when discussing the surplus killing perpetrated by lions, the technical name of which is Panthera leo, and that is that even an abundantly sated predator will take down easy prey if the opportunity presents itself. This should be obvious because if they have the power to kill and the pleasure of killing, then it's simply a matter of mood and opportunity that will dictate when they strike. So necessary things give pleasure. So for example, cursorial mammals, as in mammals adapted to running, so cursorial mammals have the same chemical reward system that we do, including the infamous endocannabinoid system, which is the built-in marijuana generator for animals, or the inner weed drip feed, as I like to call it. So this is just to make sure that animals won't avoid running for their lives because it's too much effort or something like that, which we've exploited by running around the block and having that pump feel good, yummy drug chemicals into our brain and body. Now, understandably, predatory aggression was downplayed by Newton in favor of highlighting fear-induced aggression, which sounds a little nicer. So for example, a frightened, caged lab rat is going to bite a grad student out of fear. And generally, it's pretty rare to hear political movements be genuine about how they just want to let off some steam and kill for the fun of it. Usually it's couched in some kind of righteous ideal, although you can have some really interesting and beautiful artistic representation of that feeling. One of my favorite songs is the DJ Screw remix of Mo Murder by Bone Thugs-n-Harmony. And so he takes the original song's celebration of murder, replete with that signature dense staccato rap and their melodic curlicues, And he takes that and he pitches their voices down so they sound kind of like demons. And he does this, DJ Screw does his usual cutting up of the song, which perfectly matches their, bloodthirsty lyrics. But while Newton played with giving off a scary image, when I think of Black Panthers, I think of, these really scary looking guys with guns and sunglasses. They don't look friendly. So even though he plays with that image, his politics is still Marxist-Leninist, which is to say that really there's these lofty ideals of, peaceful community where everyone lives in harmony and abundance. And so I think a more appropriate name for the group would have been the Red Rodents, especially since they were, carrying around the Maoist Red Book, right? Which that book is really not all about bourgeois individualism, as they would call it. Right? So the Red Rodents. Now, one fascinating remark from Kruuk's paper is that people reporting incidences of surplus killing were unanimous in characterizing it as wasteful. Now, I think this is because there's still this common idea that life is a struggle for existence, right? Which Nietzsche criticizes, I think quite aptly in aphorism 349 of the Gay Signs. So now I quote, "The wish to preserve oneself is the symptom of a condition of distress, of a limitation of the really fundamental instinct of life, which aims at the expansion of power, and, wishing for that, frequently risks and even sacrifices self-preservation. A natural scientist should come out of his human nook, and in nature it is not conditions of distress that are dominant, but overflow and squandering, even to the point of absurdity." Now, when you think about all the ways in which DNA just keeps making copies of itself, right? Just covering every possible surface on the planet with life, right? You take just a drop of pond water and it's just crawling with creatures everywhere, right? There's just this, like he says, a squandering and overflow to the point of absurdity. And we don't need the animal kingdom to really make this clear to us. Human life is a perpetual fountain of squandering, right? The human population has just exploded, has gushed frantically. And that's not because of timid and humble attempts at survival that just happen to result in billions of bodies. No, I think it's because human beings are the best surplus killers on the planet. And our state of desperate survival is more like an interlude to the instinct to expand our power and to squander it. Sometimes when I have the ability to waste without, having it rip my conscience apart, I feel a great psychological health. I feel freedom and power. And the euphoria is there because, well, I should say it's there, especially when accompanied with the feeling that I have the strength to get even more. Because if I'm squandering and I'm like, oh my God, this is all I have left, obviously it's going to be awful. But I'm like, oh, I have the power, the strength, the resources to get what I need. It's not an issue. That feels amazing to me. And the opposite, right? That feeling of like, oh my God, I'm losing all I have. That's horrible. It's a state of extreme distress and weakness and ill health. There's this great tweet that I read from a mother, and here, I'll just quote it for you. She says, "Just walked in on my 3-year-old, pumping all of our hand soap into the bathroom sink, chanting, 'Wasting soap, wasting soap,' to himself." So I love this because the toddler's evaluation of waste is free of moral shame, right? It's opposite. It's an affirmative joy. And really, when you think about it, this toddler's whole existence is surplus. Did there really need to be another person? Like, for what? Was it an efficient use of resources to give birth to this little human that has infinite demands? It's actually the opposite. If you give birth to a kid in a first world country, you're using tons of resources. And there's even this deranged villain in a show called Utopia, where, he explains that, people should just be killed off because they're this blight on the planet. And, to stretch out your power to make the world a tool for pleasure and play, what else is there to do? This is a common disconnect that I see between kids who want to be YouTubers or musicians or painters or dancers, just like the pinnacle of life, playful things. This is in contrast to parents who know that the flip side of these common ambitions is that you have winners and losers. I mean, the losers will be part of the tools of the winners. So, you got to sacrifice and get good grades and maybe get in the good graces of the winners and you get a piece of the pie, ideally. But, as a parent trying to make ends meet, there comes this onset of wariness, this diminishing energy, this wish to conserve, to survive, to just make it through the day. And this is a pretty alien attitude to most kids who jump out of bed early in the morning. They're, dizzy with infinite options and possibilities. They crave fun, right? Which is a waste of time. What else is more wasteful than just having sex for the fun of it, right? There's nothing really being accomplished. And when it comes to squandering sexual energy, it's really common for people to be born without any thought of utility or tenability. It's just fun to have sex, and some people come out as a result of that. I think even when it's not just people coming out because it's a result of the sex drive, when people want children, that's really the end of their thoughts. It's like, I want kids. I like having kids. They're fun to be around, and that's it, really. And you have these surplus births, so to speak, couched in terms of survival. Really, it's like, I'm just a humble family trying to get by. It's just gotta feed my kids, right? It's all kind of, I think, the most successful predator on the planet whitewashing its own behavior, reveling secretly in its ability to copy itself, right? And just spread through time and space, spread out your power and your influence. And I always find it strange when I see the opposite of this being promulgated. So for example, there's this person who works for the Center of Biological Diversity, Amarok Weiss. And on the website, they say, well, predators don't kill for fun because killing is kind of hard and dangerous, right? They might even get hurt doing all this killing. And pleasure for Weiss is incompatible with challenge and danger. And maybe that comes from an idea of protecting animals as if they're your kids or something. But, remind me, like when kids are playing, how common is it for them to avoid danger at all costs? It's usually kind of the opposite, right? Like they titrate risk because it's really fun and interesting to do risky, dangerous things. And, the motto for the Center for Biological Diversity is because life is good, right? And they have these, these pictures of butterflies and adorable little wolf cubs. And, I wonder, being torn apart by the fangs of a wolf, is that really part of a good life? Is that part of natural harmony, right? Is that working wolves just trying to get by? I don't know about that. I mean, in my own experience, I'm really afraid of spiders. And when I saw this really big spider once, I had my whole body just like charged with fear, right? It felt like a very dangerous situation because they're like dangerous predators to me. And of course, fear and danger is not really like a pleasant feeling, but the heightening of consciousness to like this sharp tack, this dagger of attention, and having my whole body rushed with adrenaline and ready to kill, and killing this spider, which yes, I managed to do it. I felt amazing. It was just like this rush of accomplishment. And so I think danger is actually really wonderful in many ways. And Nietzsche talks about its value. The opposite of kind of like being coddled and like, no danger, all safety. It's kind of like nauseating a little bit, Anyway, so Newton was a student of Nietzsche, which makes his whitewashing seem a little bit more politically calculated than naive. Now, to be fair to Newton, he was facing a really formidable predator, which is the police, right? They have tons of power and often they will not use it fairly. And now Nietzsche's genealogical study of morality, which demonstrates how the weak use insidious psychological techniques to defeat the strong. Now, this was a big inspiration for Newton, and his insistence to describe the police as pigs was an explicit form of psychological warfare, which meant to weaponize guilt to gain power. And I would argue that's only increased as time has gone on. So now I want to quote Newton and his rationale for calling police pigs. Calling police pigs raised the consciousness of the people and also inflicted a new consciousness on the ruling circle. If whites and police became caught up in this new awareness, they would soon defect from their own ranks and join us to avoid feelings of guilt and shame. And I continue the quote, Nietzsche pointed out that this tactic had been used to good effect by the Christians against the Romans. In the beginning, the Christians were weak, but they understood how to make the philosophy of a weak group work for them. By using phrases like, the meek shall inherit the earth, they imposed a new idea on the Romans, one that gave rise to doubt and led to defections to the new sect. People like to be on the winning side. We have seen the same principle work on college campuses in this country. Many white youths now identify with blacks. The identification is manifested in clothes, rhetoric, and lifestyles. End of quote. This is a very clear explanation of his political tactics influenced by Nietzsche. While Nietzsche's genealogical method makes it clear that morality is this amorphous and historically contingent phenomenon, he also had some pretty strong criticism of Christianity. So take, for example, section 62 in The Antichrist. I condemn Christianity. I bring against the Christian church the most terrible of all accusations that an accuser has ever had in his mouth. It is to me the greatest of all imaginable corruptions. It seeks to work the ultimate corruption, the worst possible corruption. This eternal accusation against Christianity I shall write upon all walls, wherever walls are to be found. I have letters that even the blind will be able to see. I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct of revenge, for which no means are venomous enough or secret, subterranean, and small enough. I call it the one immortal blemish upon the human race. Pretty harsh language. And he uses that because the price that was paid for toppling Rome was an insidious form of nihilism, according to Nietzsche, and not just devaluation of strength, health, and beauty, but of life itself. Replacing the importance of the body with this fantasy of a soul, this current world, replacing it with, this afterlife and a heaven, ignoring human difference, trying to eradicate individuality and so on. A lovely example of this hatred of life is from Pope Innocent III and a book he wrote called The Misery of the Human Condition. And I quote, he says, "Man was formed of dust, slime, and ashes. What is even more vile, of the filthiest seed. He was conceived from the itch of the flesh, in the heat of passion and the stench of lust, and worse yet, with the stain of sin. Men strive especially for three things: riches, pleasures, and honors. Riches lead to immorality, pleasures to shame, and honors to vanity." So it's almost like Newton was taking kind of the opposite lesson that Nietzsche was trying to teach, right? After all, despite its avowed atheism, Nietzsche saw in socialism the continuation of a Christian attitude because, they venerate the weak. They project a golden age into the future where, there's no more classes, there's no more exploitation. It's kind of like this paradise where everything's provided in abundance, where there's harmony, justice, and creativity for everybody. And, Newton even wrote a 10-point program where he wants, full equality, free housing, free food, free healthcare, free education, and so on. He even saw himself as something of a martyr, writing books with titles like Revolutionary Suicide and To Die for the People. In reality, he was prone to demonstrate some rather worldly behavior, so to speak, but more on this later. Anyway, what was Newton supposed to do, right? Just suck it up? Right? The polemical statement in The Antichrist is just that. It's a strident polemical point of view. But I would say that Nietzsche it's not entirely easy to pin him down on that point completely. Because the Christians, being in a position of weakness, had no choice but to use cunning to gain power. So it is still kind of Nietzschean, and power was their ultimate goal. As Nietzsche puts it, even if they practically longed for death and an escape from the world, they were still willing. Right? And here's like the bumper sticker of Genealogy of Morality. It's that humans will rather will nothingness than not will. And I've had this experience talking to antinatalists who, they're not just going to accept the fact that they have a bad life. Maybe they have a bad body and a bad mind. Rather, they choose to negate all of life, to attack it, right? To have something to attack rather than just kind of giving up their will, being like, whatever. It's like, no, rather, I'm going to condemn and attack all life everywhere forever, right? There's kind of like an interesting passion there, even though it's anti-life. So as a fun way to frame the conflict between Christianity and Rome, in keeping with our theme of big cats, I want to look at Disney's Lion King. So in Disney's Lion King, there's this harmonious kingdom where the strong and the beautiful run the show, and everyone kind of knows their place. They call it the circle of life. But it would have been boring to just watch this administrative procedure, where Mufasa, the king, teaches his heir Simba on how to, on the details of rule. So they have this villain introduced, Scar, right? And Scar, he's this disfigured, emaciated weakling who's, kind of got this ratty fur. And he connives to murder Mufasa and frame his nephew, thereby taking the throne from its rightful heir. Now, being Disney, the beautiful, strong, and healthy, and honorable Simba, he triumphs over the thin, the treacherous Scar and his troop of hideous hyenas. But, as John Holbow explains, a more Nietzschean, and I would say historically accurate, rendition of the Lion King, a Nietzschean Lion King, would be that Simba is instructed not in the joys of a harmonious circle of life, but in the pleasure of ripping apart weak and innocent prey. And Scar would be resentful, not just because he's kind of a second-rate citizen of the upper echelons of society, but because Mufasa murdered his family, and Scar is too weak and powerless to fight back. So he teams up with the weak and the ugly to launch a powerful psychological attack where he turns strength into tyranny, beauty into vanity, weakness into virtue. And most importantly, in the Nietzschean Lion King, Scar wins, right? So this psychological attack against the strong is successful. Now, if we're to go over the details of this, or to look at this in a little bit more detail, in the early stages of human history, it was understood that the community had to be prioritized over individuals, right? Long-term planning was more important than immediate gratification. And so these egalitarian early human societies were very egalitarian because they needed to avoid anyone asserting their egoic needs above the needs of the group. But this story changed whenever it came to strangers outside of the group. So the strong, aggressive tribes, the militaristic tribes, they went around and conquered all the smaller ones. And they would impose this axiomatic valuation in which the conquered population would be fundamentally inferior. And the bumper sticker phrase for this is political superiority always resolves itself into the idea of psychological superiority. And the subjugated population, the commoners, they would outnumber the conquerors, but since they weren't organized in a way comparable to the invading militaristic tribe, the vanquished became instruments for material comfort and survival. They became slaves, kind of. And now the conquerors, they would be turned into nobles. And Nietzsche calls them the knightly aristocratic masters. And these masters, they live their lives for their own sake, right? They have this powerful physicality. They have a flourishing, abundant, overflowing health. They're interested in war, adventure, hunting, dancing, competitive sports, anything that involves, vigorous, free and joyful activity. So, they're not like Scar, like plodding in the shadows, right? They're just having fun. And my constitution makes me more on the Scar side. I'm not in super great health, and I've often seen competitive sports as kind of like this stupid waste of time and energy. But what better illustration can we find of the knightly aristocratic masters today. I mean, if you're an athletic superstar, material abundance is simply taken for granted. Vigorous exercise nourishes your fantastic health. You have these worthy enemies that you battle for trophies. You travel around the world in these adventures. You have eager sexual partners everywhere you look. And it's all because you're, passing a toy back and forth or something like that. Right? Nothing's really accomplished. But, this is in total contrast to a commoner's life, which is, this grim duty of working life, which like drains your mental energy. And, if you miss a paycheck, that might mean a lack of food or warmth or shelter. Every one of your resources as a commoner, well, it's acquired painfully and managed very dutifully, and utility reigns supreme. Now, sports are anti-utilitarian pretty much. When you consider the fact that most people's calories are spent on survival rather than, passing a toy back and forth for fun. And obstacles are not overcome warily and desperately if you're playing sports or if you're a superstar athlete, but it's voluntarily there for the joy of overcoming it, right? For expressing your abundance of strength. So the fact that sports are kind of stupid and wasteful is a feature and not a bug, although this joyful activity of masters could turn into something a little ugly, right? Because a power or a love of power and domination could breed what Nietzsche said was a disgusting procession of murder, arson, rape, and torture, as if it was no more than a prank. And, if you're a peaceful slave, not trying to get in anyone's, step on anyone's toes, you'd be the victim of these pranks and you'd be too impotent to retaliate and, forced to swallow one bitter pill after the other. And, over time, if you're part of the subjected population, you start using your creativity not for joyful expression, but you start to develop this sense of morality to escape the fact that your lives are just going to be miserable from beginning to end, right? And so you focus on patience and humility, right? So if the master found delight in acting on instinct because they had the power to, and you don't, you say, well, instinct is evil, right? Or if the master hates passivity, right? You're like, well, passivity is actually really good, okay? And, being oppressed fostered creativity in these moral directions, and they also ushered in clever new forms of revenge, which took the violence and kind of ramped it up a notch. Right? And Nietzsche says that human history would be too fatuous for anything were it not for the cleverness imported into it by the weak. Right? So it's not an unequivocal dismissal of the weak, right? They have their role in human history, which, as Newton found out, is a very powerful one, even though it's not the usual power. And, so using this weakness, the mighty masters of power, they were transformed into these stunted and contemptible monsters. They would be, covetous, evil, horrible, godless, rather than wealthy, strong, fearless, or free. On the other hand, weakness and poverty, now these were refashioned as deserving of love, a love which explodes in intensity, right, in complexity, because it has roots embedded in the most profound hatred. So, consider the relish of the book of Revelation when it talks about, inflicting misery on its enemies, where people are tormented with fire and brimstone, right? And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. It's just like this hatred that's so incredibly powerful, right? And then you have, the vision of a saint's happiness as described by Thomas Aquinas, which, it's delightful because you're allowed to see perfectly the sufferings of the damned, which go on forever, right? Just constant torture. Just like, oh yes, finally, my enemies are defeated, right? And I get to see their defeat and just like, and enjoy, take profound joy in watching them suffer. And even though this hatred is deeper, there's also a new form of love that grew out of that hate. Nietzsche says, as its triumphant crown, circling wider and wider amid the clarity and fullness of the sun, and pursuing in the very kingdom of light and height its goal of hatred, its victory, its spoil, its strategy with the same intensity with which the roots of that tree of hate sank into everything which was deep and evil with increasing stability and increasing desire. So, strong hatred comes with strong love. Now, Nietzsche's genealogy of good as self-affirmation by the powerful, followed by the resentful inversion of the weak to reassess what the word good means, this actually has some interesting support in the latest anthropological research, which shows that human bodies themselves show the mark of a kind of domestication, a self-domestication. And this self-domestication solves an interesting puzzle posed by natural selection, which is how could people evolve a sense of loyalty to a large group when they're naturally predisposed to serve only themselves and their immediate kin? The answer is that over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, and probably more, the weak members of human tribes have used weapons and language to band together and cooperatively execute the members who pose a threat to themselves and their immediate kin. This would be Richard Wrangham's targeted conspiratorial killing model, which builds on the work of Christopher Boehm. In other words, our ancestors who were too competitive, strong, and selfish were murdered so consistently and systematically that it has significantly altered our genetic makeup. And one of the strange results of domesticating animals, which is to say, selecting for tameness or a reduced propensity for reactive aggression. So one of the results of domesticating animals is that it brings with it a bunch of common changes to their bodies that you wouldn't necessarily think is related to reactive aggression. So for example, their faces become shorter, they have smaller teeth, their cranial capacity is diminished, they're more social, more playful, and more tolerant. And the skull is a really striking example here because one of the hallmarks of domestication is specifically neotenous crania, which means that the skulls of the adult start to resemble what was once the juvenile phase of development. And the idea of self-domestication in non-human animals came pretty late in 2012 when it was pointed out that adult bonobos, which are like the friendly versions of chimps, adult bonobos have the skulls of teen chimps. And even humans, when you look at the shape of a human skull compared to a teen chimp, they're remarkably similar. And humans are very low on reactive aggression compared to both bonobos and chimps. And bonobos and chimps are separated by the Congo River, but there was a dry period that allowed their ancestors to move around somewhere between 1 million and 2 million years ago. And so they began to diverge into different species. Now, it's not entirely clear what selective pressures there were to initiate the self-domestication of bonobos. There might be something there with the relative abundance of food that spurred more sociability. But both their appearance and behavior shows that self-domestication did in fact occur. Bonobos are much less aggressive and they have the common traces of domestication that I mentioned earlier, which is, they're more gregarious, more tolerant, they have lighter bodies, smaller teeth, brains, and skulls. And if in fact morality is a matter of who has the power to punish or murder someone who steps out of line, we have something like a different picture of who the good guys are. By that I mean, if someone's harmless and they're physically incapable of retaliation, that doesn't mean that they're pure, or they have a pure and moral heart. It just means they're harmless, right? But if someone's harmless because they know that stepping out of line means severe punishment, but they still enjoy dishing out cruelty to people who transgress, they dish it out when they're given that opportunity, right? When they can conspire to kill a target. Well, these people, they're just cautious, right? They're prudent. They're not necessarily moral, right? They're just using power when they can. So with this in mind, let's return to the Black Panther Party and their manifesto. I want to quote just a little snippet of it here. So they say, "The swiftly developing revolution in America is like the gathering of a mighty storm, and nothing can stop that storm from finally bursting inside America, washing away the pigs of the power structure and all their foul, oppressive works. And the children of the pigs and the oppressed people will dance and spit upon the common graves of these pigs." So notice the obsession with revenge against the powerful and the similarity between this language and the conspiratorial killing model, right? There's a lot of us, the losers, the oppressed, and relatively few of them, these powerful pigs. Of course, I find it really interesting how it just assumes that whoever's doing the killing, right, this mass of the oppressed, they're all morally pure, right? They're morally pure agents who are going to wipe away the morally corrupt ones, right? Rather than what I think is happening, which is, one group just killing because they want to get power. So as Lenin explained in State and Revolution, once the morally superior people take the reins of society, they will, quote, "exercise control over the parasites, the sons of the wealthy, the swindlers and other guardians of capitalist traditions." And they'll do this using, quote, "swift and severe punishment by people who are not sentimental intellectuals. We're gonna kill them all." But of course, only up until it's fair, right? I mean, that's the fantasy. As Boehm puts it, a human group consumed with moral outrage can become a still more efficient killing machine. The moral outrage directed at class enemies during the Russian Revolution was so vast, efficient, powerful, and often lethal. But the flourishes of creativity that they had when torturing people, shows the delight of cruelty, right? And, what happens when you give people carte blanche to do whatever they want to their enemies. So they would skin people alive, they would scalp them, they would twist their heads around until it kind of like snapped them off their necks. And in keeping with our theme, they would attach an iron tube and, light it on fire. And so the rats have to dig through their bodies to get out. I mean, it's pretty rough stuff. And the Black Panthers were no strangers to the joys of torturing quote unquote enemies. And, there's this guy named Alex Rackley, this 19-year-old guy, this fresh member of the Black Panthers. And there was this paranoia going around about informants. And they suspected he was one of them. He was a rat, but not the good rat, not the red rat, a blue rat. And so the Black Panthers tortured Rackley by tying him down and, trigger warning, pouring boiling water over him. And then they let him just kind of like stew in pain and filth for 3 days. After which he was just driven mad by pain. He confessed to everything. And as a reward for his confession, they drove him to a swamp and put a bullet in his head. I think they shot him in the chest too. But anyway, another example of the righteous moral activity of the Black Panthers was Eldridge Cleaver. He was the Minister of Information, and he said that he raped white women as a form of revolution, a revolutionary act. And he also staged an ambush where 2 cops were injured and there was this teen Black Panther that was killed. And of course, there was Betty Van Patter, this idealistic woman who joined the Black Panther Party to become their bookkeeper. And she started to realize that the party was lying about their money. And as a prize for her scrupulous honesty, they raped and tortured her to death and dumped her body in the water. Her corpse washed up after 5 weeks. It took them 3 days to identify her with the dental records. And of course, Huey Newton himself, he shot this 17-year-old girl in the face for calling him baby. He really didn't like that name. And then he ordered the murder of the people who were going to testify in court against him. So not the most beautiful life story. Now, he had these megalomaniacal titles like supreme commander and supreme servant of the people, serving them with bullets in the face, LOL. But he got caught up in this free love philosophy of the 60s that everyone knows about. And, he had this very touching language about how, a man and a woman can't own each other, dude. You can't, owning someone, right, exclusively is about, borders and control and tyranny. No, dude. We're all about free love, right? For good moral people, these borders are criminal, right? You got to open up your love, right? And what ended up happening, really, is that, he took advantage of his popularity and power and just, had sex with a bunch of women because it's fun to have sex with a bunch of women. And, later on he admitted, yeah, it was kind of exploitative, but it's it's amazing to me how well he thought of himself and his intentions. Anyway, finally, he had to disband the Black Panthers because he got caught embezzling funds. Now, Nietzsche lamented what he called Christianization or rabbilization of the world. And he said that it's very thorough at this point. And quote, he says, the progress of this poisoning throughout the entire body of humankind seems unstoppable, even though its tempo and pace now might tend to be slower, softer, quieter, calmer. Now, a clear example, I think, of this kind of poison in recent times comes through someone like Mari Matsuda. And she's written about how, the outcast, the weak, the oppressed, and the poor, they actually hold a monopoly on objectively correct morality. What is suggested here is not an abstract consideration of the position of the least advantaged. The imagination of the academic philosopher cannot recreate the experience of life on the bottom. When notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice are examined not from an abstract position, but the position of groups who have suffered through history, moral relativism recedes and identifiable normative priorities emerge. Or more succinctly, she's advised us to turn the world upside down by standing in solidarity with the bottom. Now, notice the lack of self-affirmation, the absence of strength and a desire to be given a direction by a master, even though that master is at the bottom of the hierarchy. Right? I think this is understandable, right? You want to signal a commitment to harmlessness, right? Because otherwise you're going to be a target, right? So it's do not target me, that kind of thing. So I get it. And, I think she accurately echoes the popular understanding of morality, which is, you focus on the weak and the common, try to bring them up. Unfortunately, the way that states are formed, it's about subjugation. And, Nietzsche says that the artists of violence are the artists that established states, right? They conquered pacific populations. They had this active force, which he called the will to power or the instinct for freedom. But here's the interesting thing. The will to power has incarnated itself in a psychological battleground as well as a physical one. So in the same way that the master gave a new form to the society that it conquered, the master of the self is someone whose inner life is shaped by creative action rather than just passive acquiescence. So, a slave might perform good actions because he's commanded to by an external agent. It's you have to be good, right? Whereas a master lives a life of autonomy, right? It's a creative life driven by strength and health of a strong will that loves challenge and strives to become great, right? And it's hard to know what this really looks like systemically without going into a lot of detail about my own struggles and stuff like that. But, given that there's hundreds of thousands of years of human history, I would argue much more, but all this history where, it points to the necessity of conforming to the group, it's kind of prudent to kneel before weakness, or at least the ideology of looking at weakness, right? Unless you want to get torn apart by resentful creatures. And I'm a resentful person myself. I'm not someone who has a ton of power in society. So it's quite an internal struggle. And remember that humans are the greatest surplus killers. And, if the oppressed get sanctified, then all the scars in the world, the Lion King scars, they're going to compete in cunning. And there's ever greater subtlety The daggers become smaller, more concealed, right? And in my own life, this has been fascinating to watch. I've butted heads with people who will talk at length about, their commitment to making life about others, serving others, helping those at the bottom. All the while, I see them making these calculated moves in order to increase their wealth and power. So be it, because the concrete jungle will breed panthers that look like lambs, and they sing beautiful songs about the virtues of being a lamb. In terms of advice, I'd like to end with a thought-provoking aphorism from The Gay Science section, or aphorism 292, and quote, "I do not wish to promote any morality, but to those who do, I give this advice. If you wish to deprive the best things in states of all honor and worth, then go on talking about them as you've been doing. Place them at the head of your morality and talk from morning to night of the happiness of virtue, the composure of the soul, of justice and imminent retribution. The way you're going about it, all these good things will eventually have popularity and the clamor of the streets on their side. But at the same time, all the gold that was on them will have been worn off by so much handling, and all the gold inside will have turned to lead. Truly, you are masters of alchemy in reverse, the devaluation of what is most valuable. Why don't you make the experiment of trying another prescription to keep from attaining the opposite of your goal as you've done hitherto? Deny these good things. Withdraw the mob's acclaim from them as well as their easy currency. Make them once again concealed secrets of solitary souls. Say that morality is something forbidden. That way, you might win over for these things the kind of people who alone matter. I mean, those who are heroic. But to that end, there has to be a quality that inspires fear and not, as hitherto, nausea. Hasn't the time come to say of morality what Master Eckhart said? I ask God to rid me of God.